There is a quiet pain that dwells in the depths of the empathetic soul, not the kind that screams or cries out, but the kind that lingers like a mist in the forest, always present, always whispering, "You know it, don't you?" That slow erosion of the self when you feel not only your own wounds, but the wounds of those around you. That sacred burden we call empathy, which in its origin is divine, can, if unguarded, become the very force that exhausts your spirit. And so today, we must speak of it, not merely with words, but with symbols, with silence, with the raw honesty of the psyche that longs to be seen, not analyzed. In my life, I walked among dreams, shadows, and symbols, always in pursuit of what the conscious mind neglects and the soul cries out for. In this journey, I encountered many who had grown weary, not from labor, nor from trauma alone, but from the ceaseless spiritual cost of empathy. They were the feelers of the world, the unseen healers, those who would sit quietly beside another's suffering until they could feel it pulsing within their own bones. But they were also the ones who came to me tired, depleted, haunted by a truth. They could not articulate that their empathy had become a threshold crossed too many times. A bridge extended toward others but never back toward themselves. This is no ordinary fatigue. This is spiritual exhaustion, a depletion not of blood or muscle, but of essence, to always feel, to always be available to the pain of others, is to run the risk of abandoning the boundaries that define your sacred individuality. The soul is not an infinite well, though it reaches toward the infinite, and empathy, when divorced from awareness, becomes martyrdom disguised as virtue. Let me offer you a dream. As dreams often contain what the waking mind refuses to confront, a young woman once told me of a recurring vision. In it, she stood in the center of a great hall made of mirrors. Each mirror reflected not her image, but the faces of those she had loved, consoled, and comforted. They were weeping. Their grief radiated through the glass like waves. As she tried to leave the hall, the mirrors multiplied, the hallway lengthened, and in the end, there was no door, only more sorrow, and her reflection nowhere to be found. This, my friends, is the unconscious message of the over-empathetic archetype. You become lost in the mirrored suffering of others. You absorb their pain until your own face vanishes. You offer sanctuary until your own soul has nowhere left to rest. And here is the paradox: empathy is one of the highest callings of the human spirit. To feel deeply is to be alive, to be attuned to the anima mundi, the soul of the world. But every archetype has a shadow. The healer has a wound. The lover has a fear. The empath has a breaking point. The very sensitivity that enables you to commune with the pain of others can, if unacknowledged, become the axis around which your exhaustion spirals. Why? Because to truly carry the sorrow of another, one must first know the architecture of their own soul. The unconscious, if left unexplored, will draw you not into empathy, but into enmeshment. You will mistake the pain of another for your own. You will enter their archetypal labyrinth without a thread to guide you out. You will bleed internally while believing it to be noble. But nobility without boundaries is not compassion, it is self-erasure. You must ask yourself, when did I begin to feel everything? And why does everything I feel weigh so heavily now? For many, the answer lies not in this moment, but in a constellation of childhood imprints, ancestral burdens, and unprocessed shadow material. The gift of empathy is often birthed through trauma. It is not uncommon for the deeply empathetic to have been, at one point, emotionally neglected, unseen, or forced into the role of emotional caretaker long before they understood what that meant. They learned to attune to the feelings of others because their survival depended on it. Empathy became a survival skill before it was a spiritual gift. And now, in adulthood, the empath finds themselves unable to turn it off. Every room entered becomes a seance. Every conversation, a subtle transaction of energy. You do not merely listen, you absorb. You do not merely comfort, you merge, until one day your body begins to protest. Fatigue sets in, anxiety grows, emotional vertigo becomes the norm. And you find yourself unable to explain why your soul feels bruised. Even when your life appears perfectly ordered, this is not weakness. This is the cost of unbounded empathy. And the soul, ever wise, begins to protest not with words, but with symptoms. Emotional depletion is the language of the psyche crying for boundaries. The unconscious demands attention. And it does not negotiate, but let us not stay in the darkness. The descent into the underworld is but one half of the journey. As the myths tell us, one must return with the treasure, the insight, the transformation. Empathy, when tempered with individuation, becomes not a curse, but a holy conduit. And individuation, dear friends, is the sacred task of becoming who you truly are, not who others need you to be. Not the echo of collective suffering, but a soul rooted in its own depth, capable of connection without losing identity. The path forward begins with awareness. You must begin to notice when you leave yourself to dwell in the psyche of another. You must recognize the subtle shift, the tightness in your chest, the sudden emotional fog, the desire to fix, to rescue, to carry. These are signals, they are not commandments. You may choose not to follow them. You are not required to become a spiritual sponge. Your worth is not measured by how much sorrow you can absorb. Even the Christ archetype withdrew to the wilderness. Even the healer needs healing. The paradox is this: the more you honor your boundaries, the more potent your empathy becomes, because then it is no longer reactionary. It is no longer born of compulsion. It becomes a sacred offering, one you choose to give rather than one extracted from your being. I often said that the psyche is a self-regulating system like the body, and just as the body falls ill when overextended, the soul becomes weary when its boundaries are consistently transgressed. If you find yourself spiritually exhausted, it is not because you are broken. It is because your soul is speaking, and it is saying, come home to your center. Come home to your dreams, your symbols, your kid. Come home to the parts of yourself you have exiled in the name of compassion. Do not abandon your empathy, but let it be the river that flows through your being, not the ocean in which you drown. Let us pause here, not in silence, but in sacred stillness, the kind that speaks louder than words. For even in the hall of mirrors, there is always one pane of glass that shows your own reflection. You need only find it, and when you do, may you look upon your own face with the same tenderness you have so freely given to others. We continue then not as a lecture, but as a descent into that inner cathedral where the true work begins. You see, empathy unguarded becomes not merely fatigue, but possession. And this possession is not always by a spirit or some external force, but by the unconscious complexes that were never brought into the light. It is not uncommon for an empath to be possessed by the persona of the helper, the caretaker, the healer, but beware the persona, if fused with the ego, becomes a prison. The helper becomes trapped in helping. The caretaker becomes incapable of receiving care. The healer rejects their own wounds. And thus, the cycle of spiritual exhaustion deepens, not because the soul is weak, but because the self is being devoured by its own mask. You must understand that the psyche is layered. The conscious mind is but a leaf upon the vast ocean of the unconscious. Beneath every act of empathy lies a longing. Beneath every urge to rescue, a silent cry. Will anyone ever see me as I see others? And in that longing is the shadow, the part of you that has been denied, repressed, split off. The shadow does not disappear simply because you choose love. In fact, the more you suppress your own needs in the name of love, the stronger the shadow grows. I have witnessed this in dreams, in symbols, in the haunted eyes of those who have never permitted themselves to say no. The mother who feels responsible for every emotion in her family, yet collapses behind closed doors. The spiritual teacher who holds space for others, yet has never felt safe enough to grieve their own childhood. The lover who dissolves into their partner, then awakens years later with no sense of who they are. This is the danger of unconscious empathy. It demands sacrifice, but forbids reciprocation. And here we arrive at one of the most difficult truths I must share with you, one that you may resist, but must ultimately confront. Not all empathy is holy. Not all feeling is truth. There are times when what you feel is not your own, but an inherited emotional pattern, a projection, an ancestral residue to distinguish what is yours from what is not. This is the art of spiritual maturity. And that is why individuation, the great task of the second half of life, requires that we reclaim all parts of the self, not only the compassionate, but also the angry, the tired, the selfish, the primal. These two are part of the sacred self. To deny them is not sanctity, it is repression. And repression always returns, not as peace, but as symptoms. You may call it anxiety, you may call it burnout. I call it a call to awakening. We must ask, what archetype are you unconsciously living through? Are you the wounded healer, endlessly attracting those who mirror your unhealed past? Are you the martyr, convinced that to suffer for others is divine? Are you the orphan, endlessly scanning the emotional landscape for safety in another's face? These are not merely roles, they are psychic blueprints, and if they are not examined, they become fate. But awareness shatters fate, and in its place, it gives you destiny. The difference is choice. Let me tell you of a woman who came to me many years ago. She was a therapist by profession, beloved by her clients, praised for her sensitivity. But inwardly, she was crumbling. She told me she felt as though her soul was leaking through the cracks in her skin. Every client's pain became her own. She wept for others, but could not cry for herself. Her dreams were filled with images of drowning ocean tides, pulling her under, rooms filling with water, faceless children screaming for help. When we explored these dreams together, apathren emerged. Her empathy had become a vehicle for self-neglect. She had confused attunement with entanglement, and in doing so, she had built no altar for her own spirit. Slowly, we began the work not of lessening her empathy, but of rooting it, of pulling it down from the clouds and into the soil of her own being. She began to feel her own feelings, not just those she inherited, absorbed or mirrored, and in doing so, she became not less empathic, but more whole. This, too, is your task, to become whole, not holy. Wholeness is the union of opposites, light and shadow, self and other, silence and expression. Holiness without wholeness is hypocrisy. You will find, as you journey inward, that your empathy sharpens not through increased absorption, but through increased clarity. You begin to feel with, you begin to listen without merging. You begin to care without collapsing. And in that, you reclaim what the ancient alchemists called the Sol Niger, the black sun, the dark light that bursts true transformation. You see, even the most luminous empathy must be forged in fire. It must pass through the crucible of the self. Otherwise, it remains sentimentalism, codependency, a spiritual bypass disguised as compassion, but once it is transmuted through the fires of self-awareness, it becomes the very thing that heals the world without destroying the soul. And still, we are not finished. For there is another layer to this mystery, a deeper tide that pulls at the spirit of the modern empath. It is this, in an age of overstimulation, where every wound is broadcast, every tragedy made visible, the sensitive soul finds no rest. You are not only carrying the pain of your family, your lover, your friends, you are carrying the collective grief of a planet in crisis. You are attuning to the chaos of the age. And if you do not create ritual, boundary, and solitude, you will drown. Yes, even the mystical must learn discipline. I urge you now to remember the ancient ways, not the dogmas, but the inner practices, solitude, dream work, shadow dialogue, symbolic thinking. The language of the unconscious is not rational. It speaks in poetry, in images, in paradox. And it will teach you how to feel without falling apart, how to be with pain without becoming it. In one dream, I saw the world as a vast lake. The empath was standing on the shore, arms open, heart wide. Every tear shed across the world fell into that lake, and the water rose higher and higher. At last, it reached the empath's feet, then their knees, then their chest, and still they did not move, they did not build a boat, they did not seek shelter. They wept with the lake until it consumed them. But beside that lake, hidden behind a veil of trees, there was a quiet cabin, a hearth, a journal, a dream catcher, a space where the empath could return, not to reject the world's pain, but to process it, to empty, to remember that they are not the world's savior, but its witness, and that sometimes to witness is enough. So let me offer you this. Before we continue further, find your cabin, build your rituals, create space within yourself where no one else is allowed to enter. Not because you are selfish, but because the sacred demands sanctuary. You are not here to be consumed by the pain of others. You are here to be transformed by it and then to offer back your wisdom, not your exhaustion. And perhaps that is the greatest difference. Empathy given from exhaustion breeds resentment. Empathy given from wholeness creates healing. One is a slow death, the other a sacred gift. Let us pose again. Not because the teaching ends, but because the soul needs time to digest. These are not mere ideas I speak of. These are living truths, carried in your body, etched in your dreams, whispered in your moments of stillness. You know them already. I am only reminding you. Shall we continue into the deeper waters? And so we continue not down a path of instruction, but further into the labyrinth, the place within you where symbols pulse and shadows whisper. Because it is here, in the interior wilderness, that you will finally begin to grasp the true weight and meaning of your empathy, not as an identity, but as an initiation. You were not born merely to feel, you were born to become. Let us now speak of the soul's alchemy, of what happens when pain, which you have so often absorbed from others, is not transmuted. When it sits inside your emotional body like unrefined ore, it corrodes, it distorts, it attaches itself to your projections and becomes indistinguishable from your self-image. The empath who once served as a mirror for others slowly forgets that they, too, possess a face of their own. Have you noticed how often those with the deepest sensitivity speak in the language of should I, should help, I should be available, I should understand, and behind every should is the unconscious hand of an archetype, not the divine, but the distorted, the tyrant mother, the guilt-wielding priest, the shaming parent. These forces are not necessarily literal people. They are internalized figures, psychic echoes that demand perfection, performance, and perpetual sacrifice. And so you overextend, overgive, overfeel, not because your heart is boundless, but because your inner voices will not let you rest. You are trying to atone for something, perhaps an ancient abandonment, perhaps a betrayal not even your conscious mind remembers, perhaps the inherited guilt of generations that came before you, who were never allowed to feel empathy, then becomes your penance. You absorb the pain of others in an unconscious attempt to redeem your own. But my dear friends, let me say this with the utmost clarity. Your empathy is not currency. You do not owe the world your depletion. You do not need to feel pain in order to prove your love. This myth must be broken, shattered, like the brittle persona. It feeds. The soul does not flourish through self-sacrifice alone. It flourishes through integration when the inner child and the wise elder, the wounded shadow and the luminous self, all sit at the same table and are fed. I once knew a man who was deeply intuitive, so much so that he could walk into a room and know who was grieving before a single word was spoken. He called it a gift, but I watched how it wore him down. Slowly, his identity became woven entirely from the emotions of others. He feared saying no. He feared being alone. He feared that if he didn't constantly help, he would vanish. That is the danger of empathy without individuation. The self becomes a ghost in its own life story. One day, he told me of a recurring nightmare. In it, he was in a village at war. People screamed for help. Bodies lay wounded. And he ran from one to the next, trying to bandage their wounds. But no matter how fast he moved, the cries never ceased. The war never ended. At last, he fell to the ground, exhausted, and there, in the silence of his collapse, a voice whispered, "Who will tend to you?" This dream, I told him, was not punishment. It was prophecy. It was his unconscious calling him home. And perhaps that question is being whispered to you now. Who will tend to you? The answer, of course, lies not in another's hands, but in your own willingness to return to the self you have abandoned, the one beneath the mirror, the one who exists even when no one else is watching, needing, suffering. Let us now consider the symbol of the well in ancient myth and dream. The well is the place of both danger and renewal. To lower the bucket into its dark waters is to risk descent, but also to draw up the very source of life. This is the empath's task. You must descend into yourself, not to wallow, not to escape, but to retrieve your essence. When you live perpetually on the surface, skimming the emotions of others, you begin to forget that you too possess depth, your own grief, your own rage, your own divine fire. Do not fear these things. The world has taught you to feel for others, but it has not taught you how to feel for yourself. That is the work now. To feel your own grief as sacred, to allow your anger to carve boundaries, to honor your exhaustion as a signal from the divine. This is not selfishness. It is self-possession, the very foundation of all authentic compassion. Only the self-possessed soul can love without losing itself. Only the rooted heart can touch another without breaking. You are not meant to be empty. You are meant to be a vessel, yes, but not a cracked one. Repair the vessel, seal the fractures with gold, as the Japanese once did with their broken pottery kintsugi. Let your restoration be visible. Let your scars be sacred. They are not signs of failure, but of resurrection. The mystics knew this. They withdrew into silence, not because they lacked love, but because they knew that silence is the womb of truth. If you are to be a true empath, one who heals not through exhaustion, but through presence, you must cultivate silence, not just the absence of noise, but the deep inner stillness where your own voice returns to you. Do you remember your voice? Not the one shaped by what others needed, not the one trained in empathy and diplomacy, but the raw, primal voice of your soul, the one that sings in dreams, the one that howls in moments of sacred rage, the one that speaks not from the lips, but from the bones. Find it again. Speak to yourself the way you have spoken to others, with tenderness, patience, reverence. Hold your own hand in the darkness. Rock your own body when it trembles. Place your own name on the altar. This is not regression. It is the holy reversal, the moment when the giver becomes the receiver. And when you do this, something changes. You begin to feel others from a place of fullness, not deficit. Your empathy becomes sharper, not softer. You intuit with clarity, not compulsion. You give not because you must, but because you can, because you are no longer driven by invisible ghosts of guilt and shame, but guided by the still voice of the self. And that self, capital S, is the center of the mandala, the union of opposites, the reconciler of paradox, the wellspring of true healing. It is not exhausted by empathy. It is empathy in its highest form, divine, luminous, discerning. You are not here to be everything for everyone. You are here to become whole. And from your wholeness, the world will drink. Do you understand? Good. Let us take one final breath, deep into the diaphragm of your being. And listen. Listen not to me, but to the part of you that has waited patiently through every crisis, every collapse, every moment of beautiful care for others. That part now, ask for your gaze, let it speak. And now we arrive at the threshold, the final gate in this descent, and return. For all true journeys, as you well know, follow the arc of the mythos, the departure, the initiation, and the return. And what is it that you are returning to? You who have carried the pain of others for so long. You are returning not merely to the self, but to the authentic center of your being, where empathy no longer drains you but flows through you like the living waters of a spring, unpolluted by the false needs of the world. You see, there is a silence in the soul that exists beyond exhaustion, a silence not born of depletion, but of integration. It is the silence that comes when the inner voices have been listened to, not silenced. When the abandoned parts of the psyche, the neglected child, the exiled shadow, the numinous archetype have all been brought to the table and seen, not judged, then and only then, thus the empath rise not as a savior, not as a sacrifice, but as a sovereign. You must understand the radical nature of this to feel deeply and still remain rooted in your own being is one of the greatest spiritual acts of our time. We live in an age of noise, of mirrors, of performative empathy. But the one who has passed through the fire of their own suffering and emerged with discernment, that one is rare That one is powerful. That one can walk through the pain of others without losing the architecture of their own soul. And so I ask you again, are you willing to be that one? Are you willing to stand at the edge of the world's grief and not collapse into it? Are you willing to carry the torch of consciousness into the dark woods, not to rescue others, but to illuminate the path home for those who are ready? This is what it means to be a wounded healer made whole, not perfect, not invincible, but whole. And in wholeness, there is energy, there is breath, there is the resurrection of vitality that comes not from rest alone, but from the reclamation of what you once gave away too freely, your presence. Presence, my friends, is the rarest form of love. Not fixing, not absorbing, simply being. And when you are fully in yourself, you will see that others no longer drain you. Their pain moves through you, not into you. Their confusion no longer entangles your clarity. Their chaos no longer disturbs your rhythm, because you are no longer a sponge, you are a soul. A vessel, a center from which the sacred flows and to which it always returns. Let us speak now of boundaries. Not the heart, rigid walls of fear, but the conscious, loving contours of the self. A boundary is not a rejection. It is a declaration. This is who I am, and this is where I end. And it is precisely that clarity that allows you to re-enter the world not with guilt, but with grace. I often told my patients that individuation, the process of becoming who you are, requires the courage to disappoint those who have mistaken your empathy for availability. You will disappoint them, and it will hurt. But you must remember, your purpose is not to be endlessly accessible. Your purpose is to be authentically alive. Even the archetype of Christ, so often misused to glorify self-sacrifice, contains within it moments of fierce solitude. The desert, the mountain, the garden of agony, the silence before the miracle, these are not failures of compassion. They are the prerequisites for it. To retreat is not to abandon, it is to recalibrate. To withdraw is not to betray, it is to remember. Remember what? That you are human and divine, that your nervous system has limits, that your heart was never meant to carry the sorrows of the world alone. Do not try to be the ocean. Be the spring. Nourish what you can. Let what you cannot flow past you. And in this way, empathy becomes not your identity, but your offering. It is something you do, not something you are. And like all sacred acts, it must be chosen, never coerced, never expected. You will know when you have healed your empathy, because your body will speak differently. Your shoulders will not ache after listening. Your chest will not tighten when a friend cries. Your sleep will no longer be haunted by the unfinished stories of others. You will move through the world with feeling, but no longer fused to it. And that, dear soul, is freedom. Let us not forget the great paradox of healing. What once wounded you becomes the very gateway through which others are healed. But the wound must be tended, it must be seen, it must be held in loving consciousness until it no longer defines you. Only then can it be transformed from infection to initiation. In that transformation, your empathy becomes clean, clear, sacred, no longer tied to guilt, no longer driven by compulsion, But moved by wisdom, you begin to ask not what do they feel, but what is mine to carry? Not how can I help, but is my presence enough? Not how can I save them, but how can I witness them without losing myself? This is spiritual adulthood. And it is what the world needs now, not more martyrs, but more whole souls who have touched the abyss and chosen to rise. You are not here to bleed endlessly. You are here to birth something sacred. And the labor of that birth is messy, exhausting, holy, but it ends in life, not in burnout. So let me leave you with one final image. A dream I once had in the depths of my own weariness. I stood in a vast forest, filled with silent trees. The sky above me pulsed like breath, and in the center of that forest, there was a woman made of light. She carried a bowl of water. People came to her wounded, broken, weeping, and she gave them the water, not from her veins, not from her tears, but from a spring that flowed endlessly behind her. That spring was herself. She was whole, she was radiant. She had boundaries made of gold, and so can you. Drink now from your own well. Rest now in your own arms. Feel now not everything, but only what is yours to feel. And let the rest return to the earth. You are not alone. You never were. The self has been waiting. Welcome home.